Good afternoon. Thank you, Seppe. I actually couldn't hear your introduction, but I'm sure it was lovely. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to talk today about care and democratic politics because we are living in a very uncaring political world. And the question is, how can we make political life more caring? That's the question I've been thinking about for a very long time, but I'm afraid it becomes more urgent every day. Care has always existed, of course, but it has rarely taken second central stage as a concept, and certainly not in political life. Feminist insistence to recognize women's lives helped to change this, starting really in the 19th century, but especially in the 20th and now the 21st centuries. Very long time ago, I offered this definition of care with my colleague Berenice Fisher. On the most general level, we suggest that caring be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, our cells, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave into a complex, life-sustaining web. Now, to tell you the honest truth, philosophers mostly hate this definition. But we did try to clarify a little bit what we meant by organizing 5 phases of care and offering that every action of care really is a complicated piece of human activity. There are different phases of care, and they actually, I think, have different moral qualities as well. So first, we have to care about, we have to recognize that there is a problem that needs to be addressed. We need to see the needs for care, which requires the moral quality of attention. Second, we have to care for, which requires that somebody somewhere assume responsibility for the care that needs to be done. And it obviously raises this large question of immorality about the nature of responsibility. Then the actual hands-on doing of care work, caregiving, happens. And caregiving is concrete, but it also requires a moral quality of competence. Now, sometimes we think of competence as a technical skill, but it's also a moral skill, I will argue to you. Then we have to receive care. Then comes the phase of care receiving. Care receiving isn't only something that the care receiver does, but actually everyone in the situation responds to the given care and sees whether it was well done, whether it was poorly done, whether it's done enough, whether we need to do more. And it requires the moral quality of responsiveness. Finally, in 2013, it occurred to me that there's one thing missing from this definition, and that's a temporal dimension. And so I added in caring with, which requires this, that over time, as we repeat acts of care, they become reliable and dependable. It's not enough if we have food for today if we don't have food for tomorrow, or housing for today if we are housing insecure tomorrow. And these require the moral qualities of trust and solidarity. Now, this definition is very broad, and we mean it on the most general level to include everything. But obviously, care activities are, if you'll let me use Aristotle's language, nested. That is, some care activities are more narrow and try to serve a higher care purpose. Example, a phlebotomist does a good job of drawing blood, but the purpose of drawing blood is not to have blood hanging out, but it's to allow doctors and other medical personnel to make diagnoses based on the kind of markers that they see in the blood. So phlebotomists have a specific practice of care, which fits into the larger practice of medical care. And it's only on this most general level that the definition is there. Now, people often, I told you, philosophers don't like this definition because it's very broad. And it's very difficult to see then where the edge to care is. What's the end of care? Is everything care? Well, honestly, I don't mind if we think that everything is care. It's much better, I think, to be overly inclusive because we have been so unwilling to recognize and see care anywhere that I think it's a good thing that we include it everywhere. But care is not only about dependency. And often when we start to think about activities of care, we think of ourselves as a caregiver for someone else who's dependent. But care also describes the conditions of interdependence, not just of dependence. So, if this is a kind of philosophy, what kind of philosophy is an ethics of care? Now, historically, of course, philosophers have looked at deontological accounts, thinking about universal rights and responsibilities, for example, Kant, or utilitarian accounts, theorizing the maximizing of good among humans in society, Bentham Mill. Or in the last few decades, people have gone back to virtue ethics, originally in Aristotle, more recently in thinkers like Alasdair MacIntyre, where the goal of ethics is to be a virtuous person. Stephanie Collins, thinking from a philosophical perspective, offered this alternative way of understanding what she called the core of care ethics, that is, dependency relationships create and generate responsibilities. So relationships generate responsibilities. For me, as a political theorist, the problem with this is that it only explains care as an ethical concept, and ethical concepts often exist within a larger framework. The concept of care is that it is a concept and not a theory. And care always exists in societies, even deeply unjust ones, as well as just ones. Let me give you some examples of this. Already in 1995, at the very beginning of writing about care ethics, Uma Narayan argued that care is a discourse of colonialism. She was thinking of the Indian example and said, people in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, didn't get on board with colonialism because they thought, oh, it's good for us to exploit other people's resources. They thought they were bringing civilization and Christianity to these people who needed it. Slavery is a social order that has a theory of care. It's probably one that we would all reject, but it is a theory of care. That is, some people are only suited to do care work to free more prominent people to do other things. And Evelyn Nakano Glenn, an American scholar, argues that this racialized division of, uh, of work, of care work, continues to the present day. Disability scholars have argued that care constructs the disabled as less than equal to them. And in that regard, many people in the disability justice movement have a problem with the term care. So those are some examples of unjust or bad care. Here's some interviews from in Cork, Ireland, a group called Care Visions did some interviews with people who received benefits. They quoted Declan. For disabled people, care is a loss of independence, a loss of power, being in a systematic structure, usually a private business arrangement, where they undervalue you and you cover the costs. Using the term care, you are already starting from the back foot. And they quoted another person, Sandra. I think we have a sort of a system and an ideology of what care is. And I think an awful lot of people buy into that without thinking about it and then without thinking about the consequences of it. So I would suggest to you that care then as a concept requires a larger framing, and the larger framing is a political one. And in our world, the appropriate frame, and if you want to think about the equal dignity and respect for all people, the appropriate frame then is democracy. It's the appropriate frame because it includes and makes a commitment to equality, inclusion, pluralism, equal dignity, equal respect, human rights, reciprocity. The Care Visions interviewee, Neil, put it this way: this idea that care is only for the disabled or the elderly, whereas no, actually, care is for everyone. We're all going to become disabled at some point in our life. So in 2013, I published a book called Caring Democracy, in which I made the argument that we had to think about care from the standpoint of what would care look like in a truly democratic society. I argued that the great democratic revolution remains incomplete. It leaves behind those who are still associated with the work of the household. Historically, the inclusion of women and others who do the caring work is still then, I would say, the unfinished democratic revolution. It is not enough, as Charlotte Bunch said once, to just add women and stir, because when you add women, you actually have to change the way things are organized. Think of it this way. After the 19th century inclusion of working class men, it became necessary to recognize that working class men had different needs and political interests than people who were already wealthy. It required changing the social welfare system and creating conditions for workers' compensation if they were injured, for old age pensions. And that began with the inclusion of men in the political order. But after the inclusion of women and carers in the 20th century, no real change in society of that same level occurred. And now we have to really think about what would that mean to include carers and make society truly democratic. It would require us to go beyond simple justice. After all, the principles of equality emerged in the 18th century. But colonialism, slavery, racism, sexism, discrimination by religion, sexuality, marital status, birth status, language, ethnicity, and so on and so forth, continued even after these principles were enunciated, and they continue today. Well, does that mean there's something wrong with the principle? No, but it means that societies evolve in a way that doing so that often roots inequality and status deeply in its ways of being. We organize the world around colonialism, slavery, racism, sexism, thinking that women belong in the home, thinking that men deserve certain kinds of privileges, thinking that white people or Christians deserve certain kind of privileges. So having done that, we got used to organizing our world that way. So for care, the differences in gender roles, for example, hardened into spheres of life and produced what I call privileged irresponsibility. Privileged irresponsibility, to me, is one of the greatest dangers from a care perspective of unequal status. Here's what it is. Those who are relatively privileged are granted by that privilege the opportunity simply to ignore certain forms of hardship that they do not face. It's not that they refuse these responsibilities, although they do that too, but they also don't even notice they're there. Privileged irresponsibility hardens into indifference, but it also forces those who would have something noticed forced to take the responsibility for making that something seen. So it's not only that, there are dirty clothes lying all around the house and no one's picked them up, but the person who has usually to pick them up is also responsible for saying, why don't you pick up the dirty clothes? At which point that person becomes a horrible person because why are you troubling me so much? So some are excused from caring roles while others carry the burden of those caring roles. And this deepens because those who possess privileged irresponsibility never notice their privilege or their ignorance, or for that matter, their incapacities. Surrendering privilege to become equal always feels like a deprivation. If you've been in a position of privilege and now you're told you have to be equal to others, it feels as if you've gone down a notch. And so at that point, you're going to resist this and say, that's not justice, that's treating me badly. Not noticing, of course, that others have been treated badly for a very long time. So if you'll let me put it this way, simple justice is never simple to enact. So caring democracy then is going to start from a different set of premises, and there are three main elements to it. First, we have to redefine democracy itself. Democracy is a way to allocate caring responsibilities in a society in a just way. So we have to change our understanding of politics. It's not about the economy, stupid, to use Bill Clinton's phrase, although that's part of it, but it's about the way we allocate caring responsibilities. And how are we going to do that so some people aren't overburdened, and other people are set free from these burdens? Second, we have to reorganize caring responsibilities. Some currently can avoid or deflect their caring responsibilities, just not notice them, not pay attention to them, assume that everything works the way it does just perfectly. And so everyone has to begin to be responsible for care. And thirdly, and really importantly, we have to use democratic means to arrive at caring solutions. Now, this is a hard point to make because care is often not about equality, right? If you're helping someone meet some needs, it feels as if the person who's needy is really not in an equal position with you. And if you've ever been yourself in the position of needing someone else's help, it's not a position of equality that you feel yourself in. So how do we manage over the course of people's lifetimes and over the course of a day for us to both feel like we're needy, because we are, and also feel like we're caring, and somehow think about that balance, not only for ourselves, but for everyone and for the society as a whole? How can citizens learn to practice care democratically? Which requires, of course, that all voices be incorporated. So we have to limit hierarchies, we have to make room for all voices, and we have to be open and think about what's happening for us. So it's clearly the case that at the moment, democracy needs reform. The decline in support for democracy is demonstrable. I've been saying this for a long time before the 2024 elections here in the United States. But in a research survey done by the Pew Research Group in 2019, they asked people, do elected officials care about ordinary citizens? Most elected officials care what people like me think. And all over the world, most people disagreed with that statement, that in fact, people in elected office care about them. 69% of people in the so-called developed world or the higher income countries disagree that public officials care about people like me think. Back in 1988, Harry Frankfurt, the great philosopher, wrote a wonderful little essay called The Importance of What We Care About. And he said, what we care about doesn't show up in deontological thinking or virtue thinking even, or in utilitarian thinking, but it really is what defines our moral fiber as individuals. And if we ask the question, what do governments care about now, we get a very different answer. Now, we could ask the question, why is this decline in commitments to democracy occurring? And I think there are a bunch of answers. First of all, there's a decline in support for all forms of authority. Why? Well, partly this is a result of the intense privatization and economic dislocation of the current world. The family is left as the only viable institution. The rise of new forms of media mean that authoritative sources of information and knowledge don't have the same status that they used to have. I'll say a word about families. UCLA has done a survey since the 1970s and asked students coming into college, who are your heroes? And it used to be that they would name people like Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela or public figures who they thought of as heroic. Now, when you ask college-age kids, who are your heroes? Their answers are my mother and my father. And that's about it. Because the idea that there are people outside of your own family who are going to help you out and support you seems to completely have disappeared. Second, democracy has not delivered on its promise, right? Democracy does not, in fact, create or value equality, and so it looks like a hypocrisy. And finally, so-called democracies, we could say, really are a form of oligarchy. And this has been true for a very long time. Business and wealth interests are always overrepresented in the kinds of decisions that governments make. This is true in the United States. It's also true around the world. A study done by Jeffrey Winters back in the 1990s looked at the question of oligarchy, and he concluded even that Sweden really has an oligarchy that's running its country. The difference between, for Winters, good and bad oligarchies is whether or not they're also willing to abide by the rule of law. Good oligarchies do, bad oligarchies don't. Anyway, how does a care ethics then help us to redefine democracy? As I've said, democracy becomes a way to allocate caring responsibilities in a just way. So what does this change require conceptually and practically? Well, right now, what we care about, I come back to this question, what is it governments care about? What we care about are two things, I would say: wealth care, and protection. Right now, we live in what I would call wealth care regimes. Economistic languages and standards are used to judge everything and to shape how we make all decisions. The economy has come to seem as if it's natural. Let me give you some examples. Early in the pandemic, in the United States especially, there were huge struggles to find enough personal protective equipment. I mean, just masks and gowns. In New York City here, people were using plastic garbage bags to go into intensive care units where people were very sick with COVID because there weren't any gowns left. Well, why? Well, there had been one after another public health official saying we don't have sufficient levels of PPE stored in case there's a pandemic. But you don't make a lot of money making paper gowns that can be thrown away. And as a result, because it wasn't sufficiently profitable, nobody bothered to restock the stores. There's a commercial that's running in the United States now on television where people are told to invest in your best investment. It's an ad for parents to teach their children about using money, because that's the way that we can invest in our best investment. So what's wrong with wealth care? I mean, it's a system, I think, that exists. You would, if you look around, you see that basically everything begins to get measured in economic terms. But what's wrong with it? It relies first on a false set of assumptions about the economy. The free market is a myth, but it does have this important effect of making people stop thinking about society. As Karl Polanyi argued, under the conditions of neoliberal economic thought that the free market is in fact free, we only think of ourselves as workers and consumers. We stop thinking of ourselves as citizens. Economic measures then become the measures of everything. What is the return on investment of the liberal arts? What is the value of the arts? All of these questions become real questions. Why should I invest in helping children in an orphanage? And the people who run the supports for young children now will say, if you do this, they will live more productive lives. And so in the long run, if you invest now, you're saving money later. Well, that's an argument to make, but it's not the argument that humans deserve care and we should care for them, right? It's a different way of thinking. It means that everybody has to participate in the economy. And if there are a few who can't, or if there's some problems that come up along the way, the family should support those people. Well, there's another aspect to the contemporary turn away from care, I think, that's really important for us to notice. And that is that authoritarian forms of protection are often disguised as a form of care. We say to people, you are not safe. And as a result, people are afraid. Now, when people are afraid, they want to be made safe again. And so this authoritarian form of protection divides people and makes them think that some people are worthy of protection and others are not. Now, you don't want to make it too clear what being worthy means, because if you do, then you don't. Then part of the way the logic of protectionist care works is that you don't let people know what it means for them to fall into the other side. So you keep them in a constant state of fear and anxiety and wanting to remain within the in group. So you offer to protect people and you say, if you are a genuine fill in the blank, then we will support you from those other people who we know are horrible and can hurt you. But this kind of protection is necessarily and always a kind of parochial, that is local or narrow forms of care. It has to assume that there's an enemy out there from whom you need protection. Well, I'll say one more thing here. There was a wonderful essay written by Iris Marion Young. It was published in 2003, but it was written right after the attacks in the United States on September 11th, 2001. And she argued, we become infantilized if we want the state to protect us. And if we live in a state of fear, then we become people who are subject to the manipulation of someone who would fulfill our childish wish to be protected. But it makes us not citizens, but children. So the consequences of the ways of thinking like this are these. First of all, it generates a form of inequality. It divides the world into us and them, and it makes them lesser, scary, less morally worthy. Second, it makes us passive as citizens. It forces us not to be active and thinking and challenging. It makes us have to buy into the logic of, I'll protect you if you're good and worthy of my protection. So then you kind of try to act to meet the wishes of this protector. In contrast, caring democracy requires something very different. It requires active citizens who participate as and understand their roles as people in caring relations. People are always both actively giving care and actively receiving care. Now, since most of us, when we're engaged in activities of philosophy, are relatively competent adults, we don't notice how much care is going on in our own lives because much of it at this stage of our life is self-generated, right? We care for ourselves. I managed to get myself dressed this morning, for example. But all of us are always receiving care as well as giving care. Somebody prepared your breakfast today. Maybe it was you, and maybe it was someone else. Someone prepared that meal that you're going to buy and take home for dinner, right? So we are always engaged in care, both receiving care and giving care. It's more obvious when we are infirm or old or young, very young, that we need care. But people are always on both sides of care. But so what caring democracy requires us to do is to create really a kind of solidarity among those of us who recognize the importance of care. And then we need to take power away from those who would devalue care or deny care to some. And we have to see that those who devalue care are those who are privileged enough to avoid it. So active democracy requires that everyone care. It requires that everyone care about, care for, engage in caregiving, and care with those with whom one is in caring relationships. It also requires that we care about, care for, give care, receive care, care with those, making certain that society provides enough resources for everyone to receive the care that they would wish and to give the care that they would wish. So caring about democracy itself then becomes a way of solving political problems. Care ethics is in this way closely related to what my dear colleague Margaret Urban Walker in her book Moral Understandings called an ethics of responsibility. And there's this wonderful sentence in Margaret's book that kind of puts this, that helps me a lot. She says, an ethics of responsibility as a normative worldview would try to put people and responsibilities in the right places with respect to each other. It's a beautiful short statement. Put people and responsibilities in the right places with respect to each other. Not overburdening people of color who do all the care work and also have to commute 2 hours to get to the job and so on and so forth. That's not putting people and responsibilities in the right places. They're overburdened. And so we'd have to think through all of these kinds of questions in order to arrive at a more decent, caring, democratic society. So how do we resist the authoritarian protectionist call to care? Because let's face it, it's a powerful call. But there are two things we have to do. The first thing we have to do is stand up as democratic citizens and say, no, 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 we're not falling for this trick of being made into infants who need protection. And the second thing we have to do is to demand and aim not for protection, but for safety, or if you will, order. I mean, when you think about it, safety is a really central part of care. I'm not a parent myself, but everyone I know who is a parent tells me the most important thing in my life is that my children are safe. That's a really, really powerful motive for people to act. But safety can come if there's a protector, but if you turn your conception of safety over to a protector, it also means that there are enemies out there. There's another way to do this, and that is to think what we need for safety is to create sufficient order that there aren't any people out there who are so dangerous. Order. I just went to the dictionary. Order requires a condition of logical or comprehensible arrangement among the separate elements of a group. It's a condition of methodical or prescribed arrangement such that proper functioning or appearance is achieved. So when we order something, we make it possible for everybody to both care and be cared for in turn. And under those conditions, nobody is threatening us. Under those conditions, we can all be relatively safe. We can never be 100% safe because there are, in fact, there are natural disasters, there are accidents that happen, there are some small number of people who mean us harm, or animals or plants that mean us harm. But the world could be a lot safer if we focused on order rather than on being protected, which means to be covered or shielded from exposure, injury, damage, or destruction, to be guarded. That necessarily makes us into people who are more frightened, more guarded, more partial, and that's what we have to try to resist. I don't mean to make it sound as if care is a solution to all our problems, because it isn't. Care itself comes with two huge problems. That is, that it's always a danger of paternalism in care. That is, that the person doing care work for someone else will think they know better what the care receiver needs. And that paternalism isn't only found in families, it's found in the state, it's found in bureaucracies, it's found in all kinds of institutions. But it's a real danger, and we have to try to overcome it. And second, there's always this danger of parochialism, of localism, of thinking the people around me deserve more care than those people, or I only will pay attention to the people closest to me, and the rest of them, too bad for them. Let them fend for themselves. So it's not as if care is a magical solution to the problems of inequality, or the problems of injustice, or the problems of exclusion. And there are, after all, some very large, even if we lived in a caring society, we would still have huge political problems to face. It wouldn't be everybody agrees on everything. It would be a lot of politics, a lot of conflict. Here are some reasons why. One, how do we determine which needs for care to meet first? Second, we might want to think about the question, is care right, even a human right? And if so, what does that mean? Third, should care focus on humans, or should we extend it? Not only to humans, not only to our own people in our own country, not even to all humans, but to other animals, to the biosphere, to the planet? And if so, how do we do that? Fourth, are there aesthetic dimensions of care that we have to take into account? Sometimes an act of care, when you see it, is beautiful. And that's the only word to describe it. And should we be thinking about that? And fifth, the big question, where and how do we start to end the carelessness of our current societies? Because we are living in an extremely careless age. And if we don't correct course, it's very difficult to imagine that the planet won't figure out a way to do it for us. So thank you. I've tried to present you with a view of how a caring democracy could move us closer to a society in which all people are well cared for, and a society which I would argue to you is one in which we would rather live. Thank you very much. I can't hear you. Let me see what happens if I try that. You can hear me, yes? Okay, I can't hear you. Oh, I hate Microsoft Teams. Mm-hmm.
Do you hear something now? Can you hear yourself?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you, Joan. I mean, that was fantastic. It was tremendously enriching to hear your thoughts. There were so many important insights on about politics, justice, oppression, solidarity, um, all of which are very, I mean, timely questions. Like today, there's the hands-off march in the US. You know, it's kind of it all speaks to this. It ties in with all of this very very nicely, and I can imagine that people here in the audience will also have some thoughts and emotions, ideas about much of the things that you discussed and presented very clearly to us. Before, because I've been writing all of the time, so I have some questions and questions to ask you too. But before I ask them or go over them, I'd like to ask if anyone in the audience would have anything to ask or to yes, yes, please.
Hello. I really love your thoughts about care, so thank you for that. My question is one of the questions you asked yourself in one of the last slides. It's about the inclusion of the non-human species. One of the reasons why I think it's important is I think without care for the non-human species, we will never be able to handle the climate problems properly. I'm sorry for my English, but I would like to hear some thoughts of you about that. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. I think you're absolutely right. We need to be attentive. we need to be attentive to other species. And most importantly, here's one of the things I've learned about care over my life, and that is once we start noticing needs for care, we notice needs for care. And so once we start to pay attention to how other species have needs and how we abuse them, we begin to include not only other species, but also then we start to think about the environment. We start to think about plants. We start to think about just the physical environment of the world. I think you're right that here's the thing, there are many places to jump in and start. But wherever we jump in and start, and if we start with other species, we become attentive to the fact that creatures other than humans have ways of communicating, can communicate even with us, and we need to be listening, right? And so it expands our capacity to listen to others, but it also then expands our capacity to listen to other humans. And so the more we engage in caring practices towards animals, the more likely we are to be able to increase our capacity to care as well for the planet. I think you're right. The climate change solutions will not come without paying attention to this. And I would say this furthermore. Different people, because we're different people, have different passions about what it is they care about, to use Harry Frankfurt's phrase. And if what you want especially to focus on is how much we need to be attentive to the needs of other creatures, that's perfect. Not everyone will agree with you that that's the first priority, but if everyone has some priority about what care requires, we all become along the way more sensitive to others' needs and to the needs of the planet. Thank you. It's a great question. Maybe you're satisfied with the answer? And forgive my Flemish, you know.
Thank you, Joan. There's another question right here in the front.
Hello, Professor Tronto. Thank you for your enriching lecture. So my question, in regards to your presentation, would you say that development aid is a form of care, or rather that a caring development aid, either as it currently exists or in concept, is a contradiction? And I am asking this.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I am asking this question because you spoke about care being a colonial concept and about the contradiction between capitalism and care. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you're right in both dimensions. That is, that care can be colonialist and it can be further the interests of capitalism. And on the other hand, aid can also be really important. I mean, I wish I could apologize for the U.S. government, but you know, they're not me. I'm going to the demonstration right after this talk. But what's there are different ways to organize aid, right? And one way to organize aid is by asking the people who are in extremis, what do you need? What do you want from us? Another way is to say, we're going to give you what we have and which we think you need, the paternalistic way. And so it's a bad form of care if it's done with paternalism or to meet our interest rather than the interests of the people who are there. And it's often the case that people who need care need to just aren't asked what it is they're needed. I said this once to some people who were working in international aid, and they said, oh, we have a checklist now, and we give it to them and say, which of these things would you like? I don't think a checklist is quite the same as listening to what people's needs really are. Among other things, if there's an unequal power relationship, which there is in most conditions, how do you know that the people who are saying what they need are actually saying what their needs are, rather than kind of moderating their sense of needs and telling you what they think they need because it's what you will give them, right? So there's that problem as well. It's a very complicated question, but in general, I guess my answer is it depends.
Thank you. Thank you for a great question and a great answer.
Yeah.
I think there was another question here in the front.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. I was wondering, maybe from a more practical standpoint, like where do you start with the care? Is it like the attention that you seem to mention a lot, at least in your response to the first question, or is it something entirely else?
Where you start is where you are. What you're interested in, you start where you are. The world has more caring needs than can ever be met. Well, each of us has more caring needs than we can ever meet. And the key is to the key is to do two things. One, not lose sight of the fact that this is a political question, and there are always issues of power engaged in these questions of care. Some forms of care help the powers that be, and some forms of care don't. And if you're interested in making the world a transformed place, then you have to be a little paying attention to where is the power of care, right? I was speaking yesterday to a disability scholar who said there's a difference between some of the people doing research on autism whose real goal is to identify the genes so that they can eliminate autism from happening. And that's a very different approach to the question of autism from people on the spectrum of autism have lives and they need certain things that are a little different from what other people need. And we need to make provisions for them to be able to care well for their lives. Two approaches to the same problem. One, I would say, is caring. The other one, I would say, is not really caring in a fundamental way. So it's not only about intention, but it is about the fact that I don't think we can say there's a blueprint for what we need to do. What we need to do is to everywhere begin to transform, to shift our perspective so that care is the starting point and the starting question rather than something that we have to think about at the end. Oh my gosh, look at that, we forgot about. We built a beautiful building, but we forgot that it's going to need maintenance. And the kind of maintenance going to need is prohibitively expensive. So architects need to start thinking about designing buildings with care, not only for the building that they put up and sold to someone, but for the building as it's going to exist for however long that building is going to exist, right? So practically, it's a question of changing the way we look at the world, which sounds too impractical, but it's actually in different practices. Remember, practices are nested. At every level, we need to incorporate care at the beginning of what we're thinking about. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer.
I think it is. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, the mic is on the way.
Hello. My question is more on the humanity side. So do you think that us humans actually have the capability to care for one another properly because we are wired for survival? And if all of us in this room, for example, only had one piece of bread and we were locked in here, I'm pretty sure all of us would fight for that piece of bread. And instead of caring for one another and dividing it equally, for example, do you think that we really have that capability to properly care for one another and put our selfish needs aside?
Humans are both caring and not caring, right? But the question is, listen to the example you just set up. One piece of bread, I don't know how many people are there, but I think it's more than 5. So
I think it's about
one
said
piece of
by
bread,
you.
one piece of bread, and you're locked in a room. Who did that? Right? Who put you there and put you there with one piece of bread? Of course, they want you to fight over the piece of bread. But the question is, to what extent is scarcity a reality in human existence? Or have we created conditions under which we feel as if we're constantly in conditions of scarcity? So that's one part of the answer, that this idea that we are constantly, it's just so natural of us because we've been trained in a political economy that really generates all of its wealth out of the condition of thinking that we are going to be undone by scarcity, that we have to kind of constantly be accumulating stuff. That's a way of thinking that makes us move in the direction of greedy rather than the direction of caring. Here's a second thing. And psychologists have done studies with children who are 10 months old. And when you're 10 months old, chances are you're not really good with the spoon eating. Your parents or some adult carer. And they did this experiment. They filmed carers taking a spoon and taking and putting in the food in it, and then taking it to the baby's mouth. And as they approach the baby's mouth, they would open their mouth and go, ah, and then the baby would eat the food, right? They put the spoon down. The baby picks up the spoon and puts food on it and takes it to the carer's mouth. And as the baby's doing this, it's going as well. When I heard this presented by a psychologist, he showed us a lecture of a group of first-year students in psychology watching this on film. And guess what was happening to all the people in the audience? They also were all going as the baby got the spoon close to the adult's mouth. It's natural. There is something hardwired into humans for our survival, if you want to put it that way, that we have to cooperate and care for each other in order to live. That's true because human infants are born way too early to take care of themselves. But it's also the case, I have a dog. I read a lot about dogs. That although Darwin talked about the survival of the fittest, people who study dogs talk about the fact that the dogs who evolved proved the survival of the friendliest. That is, the dogs that could look in humans' eyes and look like they were looking at them kindly were the dogs that got bred and kept, and the wolves who kind of went, you're a human, I don't really care about you. Those wolves were not the ones who were brought in to live in the pack with the humans. So the survival of the friendliness is another way of thinking about what's hardwired into humans. So care is a part of us. Now, it's also the case, there's a wonderful sentence in Sarah Ruddick's book, Maternal Thinking, where she says, children are vulnerable, and being vulnerable, they invite one of two responses, care or aggression. I just find that to be one of the most profound ways of putting this really difficult point, that one of the things that happens sometimes to children, to weak beings, to kittens, is that humans treat them cruelly. And that cruelty is part of our human nature as well. It's true. But the question isn't why, how can we possibly care because we're this way? The question is, how can we organize, how can we order society in such a way that the caring responses feels more natural and more humane and more simple and easier and better than the responses which are aggressive? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. Why are we living in a society where these kind of aggressive, scarce, dog eat dog rather than dog be friends to humans, dogs be friends to other dogs way of living seems to us to be more natural? So that's how I'd answer your question.
That's a very
Does
great
that-
answer.
does that-
Thank you very much. Yes,
Okay.
it has many different perspectives, so definitely I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi. I wanted to get back to the first question, in fact, where somebody was asking about the care for non-human species and the care for the planets, which is one of the biggest challenges that we are facing today. I wonder what your thoughts would be on the challenge to enhance the care for the planet on a global level, since one of the arguments you often hear by people, they're saying, well, why should I care for the planet when my neighbor isn't? Why doesn't the government care for more for the planet? And what about China? If I care for the planet and in China they're still polluting, so it's no use, so I shouldn't care for the planet. So how could we stop this narrow thinking that why should I care if my neighbor isn't?
This is a really difficult question, and you're absolutely right to notice it because, yeah, why should I be the one who takes on this responsibility? And it has to do with this question of responsibility. To what extent are you responsible? I mean, after all, if your government isn't doing what it should either, on some level, you're responsible as a democratic citizen for the fact that the government isn't doing that. But again, we live in an age where we've been so trained into thinking that's not our role. Our role is as workers, as consumers. We're not really citizens very much, and we can't do very much as citizens, so let it go. Or alternatively, if I recycle my paper, I'm changing the planet. Well, no, actually, you're probably not. We've all been sold a bill of goods, really, to some extent about recycling. The plastics are very difficult to recycle, right? How would we, I mean, could I eliminate plastic from my life tomorrow? Probably not, right? Even these glass frames are plastic. I'm not going to do it. This computer is made up of plastics and rare earth metals and all kinds of things that, my gosh, maybe I shouldn't have, right? But I'm not going to give up my computer. Okay. So then what do we do? It's a really difficult question. Part of it, though, comes out of thinking the other way. Instead of thinking about what am I responsible for, think about in what way am I acting irresponsibly? What is my privilege to act irresponsibly? That's a privilege. It's not just don't just toss it off. It is, in fact, a way of being privileged in the world. And if your neighbor wants to keep hold of that privilege, then you have to ask your neighbor, why? Why do you think you deserve to hold that privilege? What is it about you that makes you not have to care for the planet? I mean, because, if we keep going, here's what the planet's going to do. It's going to say, there's a species, there are many billions of them, they're really disastrous for us. The New York Times published a graph a few months ago that showed that human-made product now holds more mass than all of the biosphere on the globe. Isn't it? It's an astonishing thought. And if we could get rid of those humans, the world would be a better place. And so the atmosphere will change, or the climate will change, and something will happen, and we'll all be gone. Is that a good outcome? I don't think it's a good outcome myself. But that seems to be where we're headed if we don't all start to take some responsibility for this. It's really a hard question to say, how do we overcome this collective action problem of some people would rather just keep going the way they are, and others are willing to begin to take responsibility. There are things you can do, right? You can act collectively to impose costs on the people who would just, as the language in philosophy, economy languages, people who would just free ride and wouldn't take any responsibility. You can impose costs on them. You can tax them. You can shun them. There are all kinds of mechanisms, if we have a set of rules, by which we can make other people obey. But the first thing we have to do is make a set of rules. We have to say to people, this is what's acceptable levels of consumption. This is what's acceptable ways of interacting with the kinds of natural resources that exist in the world. And these ways are unacceptable. And so, under those conditions, when the rules are set, then we can begin to say who's acting responsibly and who's not. At the moment, it's just that we're just so unclear about what it is we even need to do. Despite all these wonderful meetings by the IPCC and all of the proposals that they've made, it's really difficult as a single individual to kind of pick up the UN reports and decide how you're going to live your life in a way that conforms with what you should be doing. But those are the conversations that a democratic citizenry should be having now. What is the way that we as a group of citizens can move forward to improve the quality of the world? You're right, if we leave it up to individuals, it's not going to happen, because individuals will always find a way to think of themselves out of their responsibilities, right? And take the privileged way out. But when we begin to think about the collective level of responsibility that we have, then we can begin to notice that these problems are.
Yeah. Thank you, Joan. I think
Maybe that's a help. I don't know if it's a help.
Yeah.
Okay.
I see some nodding. Yeah. I think it's a great take on a difficult and on a hard question. I think there was another question here in the front, somewhere over there. Yeah.
Hey, Joan, in a society where we would share care equally among people, would there still be a place for the family, or should we rather abolish the family?
I don't know. What do you think?
I also don't know. That's why I ask you.
Yeah. So the family has historically been, human infants are vulnerable, and there's no way around that. And someone has to take the special responsibility for these extremely vulnerable individuals, and the family seems to be one way to do that. It's not the only way, but it's a way to do that, right? And families don't have to be nuclear families either, right? They don't have to be two parents and two kids. They can be, we could think of different ways of organizing families. Will humans always want to live in ongoing communities or small groups where they share bonds of affection? I think so. I think part of caring with, this idea that we can rely on one another, is part of what makes our lives worth living. My partner and I would be really sad if we couldn't live together and live the life we live together, right? So I think families on some level are here to stay. Families of the structure that we currently have, I don't know. And it may be that's one of the questions that we need to be asking. How can we support, and I don't want to say that the family structure we have is bad. For some people it works really well. For other people it doesn't work very well, right? If there's someone in a family who's abusing other members of the family, why would you want to say that should continue simply because it's a family, right? So what we would want to do, and this is, I think, always a part of the answer when we come to try to think about care institutions, is to create pluralities and to create the conditions where lots of different forms of family would all be recognized, able to function, able to do what they do well, and give people the option of staying in a family, leaving a family, changing the family structure over time. And that would be an ideal way to meet the needs of people and also their wants and desires, which are also part of making life good.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you so much. I just have a short question because you just mentioned care institutions, and I was wondering, what your thoughts are on the role of education as a care institution, as a place where we show care, but also what is our role as educators in attuning people towards care.
Thank you. That's a lovely question. And I do think of educators as people engaged in care, and as educational institutions as care institutions. There's a beautiful book by Wendy Luttrell where she talks about the research she did with 10-year-olds about their experience of care. And the 10-year-olds took her around the school to introduce her to the school. And here's what they said. They said, now this room is the kindergartner's room, the first year, the very 5-year-old's room. And it's close to the cafeteria, and it has to be close to the cafeteria because you don't want the little kids to get lost as they're wandering around the school. So it's good that they get to go right from their classroom right over to the cafeteria. Imagine that. The kids had organized the way of thinking of how the school was arranged in terms of the caring needs of the kids. The kids had done that, not the adults. Frankly, the adults probably hadn't even thought about it, but the kids had done that. And as a result, we recognize that care really does infuse what's happening in education. We can educate people in a more caring way, right? Insofar as education becomes competitive and transactional, it loses the quality of care. And so as educators, we have to fight against institutions which are increasingly pulled into the political economy of scarcity, more production, more efficiency, because education isn't about efficiency and it's not about productivity. It's about each person being able to grow. And that's part of what it means to care, is to help things grow, right? And so helping people learn is one of the most important things that we can do as people and institutions. Most institutions of learning that I know of, I'm sorry to say, don't do a very good job of caring. And at many universities now, there are people beginning to think about how could we make this institution more caring? And it's a good question to ask because it's a really difficult one. One of the things I haven't mentioned yet that's really important to think about with regard to care is this. Care takes a lot of time. Time is the single most precious commodity we have. There is a scarcity, right? We all have so many years of life and that's it. And so many seconds in a day and that's it. That's the end of it. There's a limit. There really is a limit to our time. But we spend so much of our time doing so many things that are inconsequential and so little of our time doing care that we really need to rethink what it is for us to put care at the center in terms of time. Because if we did that, we would notice things like sometimes this lesson takes 20 minutes and sometimes it takes 40 minutes. It depends on the kids who are there and whether or not they've managed to grasp it, or if there's another question that comes up or a problem that comes up, or if it goes in a different direction than you thought it would as a teacher, right? Time, I mean, when I would teach, I would have a syllabus. I would know exactly what I was teaching each hour of the semester for 15 weeks. But really, when you think about it, that's not a very caring approach, because sometimes the students would need a lot longer to digest an idea and sometimes a lot less. And so building more flexibility into our educational system would be one way of increasing the capacities we had for care. Now that's hard because we expect people who are 7 years old to have learned this much and people who are 15 to have learned this much. The question is, how can we both accommodate the needs of our society so far as we have to, and still make it as caring an institution as possible?
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful answer to a wonderful question. We have another question right there.
Thank you for your yes. I don't know the words.
It's okay.
I'm in a wheelchair, and I think that in a capitalistic system, care goes more and more together with economic interests, and then it means the carer has very little time to care. What do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right. And the kind of logics of new public management, of greater efficiency in caregiving have really worked against the interests of people who receive care. There is some pushback to this. There are some places now where, I mean, the rules are just crazy, right? That they assign to caregivers and people who help out people who need care. There's so many places to intervene on this question. First, why haven't we decided that every building built from now on should use universal design? Every building should simply be accessible to all. And if it isn't, then don't build it. Literally, don't build it. Why would you do that? And second, we can do so much more to make our world more accessible to people in wheelchairs so that some kinds of problems don't require help, but others will always probably will. And under those conditions, why don't we make adequate provision for the people who do the care and trust them to do the care well? They get supervised, they get micromanaged, they have their time controlled by someone else. There have been some experiments in giving visiting nurses more autonomy to do the work that they need to do. So in most places, visiting nurses are given a checklist of things that they are supposed to look at when they go visit someone who's indisposed and at home. And generally, because they're nurses, sanitation isn't included on that list. So they can go and check off the boxes. I gave this person the medicine they needed. And the person's sitting in a dirty diaper, but the nurse doesn't have time because she's only been told to do these 3 things to actually help with that honestly really serious human problem. And it's a health problem as well, right? So they've started to say, no, look, you have 5 clients today, take care of them, do what you have to do. Those nurses then are able to say, you know what, you need some help here, let me do this. Also then noticing that there might be a rash or some other kind of medical problem. So it turns out to be better care if it's less controlled by somebody who has a checklist from somewhere else about this is what you're going to need. But we're moving in, society's moving in the direction of everything should be on a checklist. AI will generate the checklist for us. We can know exactly what it is that a nurse needs to do when she goes to visit a patient with condition X. And it's just not, it's not humanly possible to operate that way. So you're quite right. We have just moved in the wrong direction here. And what it will take to move in the right direction is for people to say, no, stop. This isn't what we want our society to do for us. Even if it means sacrificing some things, like new highways or new cars or whatever, we should do that.
Can I ask something else?
Please.
It's the same thing. The nurses who give care to me are independent nurses, so they work for themselves. So the more patients they see in a day, the more money they have. And that's what I mean in a capitalistic system. From today, it's the economic and the money interest who counts, not the care the people need.
You're absolutely right. a long time ago, back in the 1980s, I was speaking to a doctor who worked in the United States for the Veterans Administration, which at the time was gave some of the best medical care in the United States. And I asked him, why do you work there? And he said, because I have a salary. It doesn't matter how many patients I see, I get the same amount of pay. And it means that I can actually focus on what my patients need. Now it's all turned into this, as you say, every 10 minutes, if you don't have a new client, you've lost money and you're going to get reported. And it costs you so much to go to medical school that you really need to generate that kind of money to pay back your debts. And so it's a crazy system that we live in. I'm sorry that you have this experience and that the nurses feel this pressure. And what you wish would happen is somebody would say, this is crazy. Let's give them a salary that's high enough that they can live decently, and then give them a number of clients, which is a reasonable number of clients, and let them work from there. There's a nursing shortage, right? And part of the nursing, there's this funny negative feedback loop. And I've actually looked at this question with some scholars from Louvain in Belgium. A lot of the people who are trained as nurses in Belgium and elsewhere around the world, or begin their training, don't become nurses. And they don't because they went into the profession thinking that what they were going to be able to do is take care of people. And what they learn early on is that there are all these other pressures on them, mostly about time and money, and organization, that have nothing to do with the care of the patients in front of them. And as a result, they become disillusioned and quit the profession. I was talking to a group of scholars who were working with first-year nursing students. And after the first month in the hospital, about a third of them quit. A third of them quit. So what does that tell you? That tells you the hospital is a really inhospitable environment for the nursing students to learn to be nurses. And if that's the case, why are we, this is a real, if you even wanted to think economically, you'd say, we're letting a lot of money out the door there. Why don't we train them better? No, it's not about training them better. It's about creating institutions which are less short-sighted and more long-sighted about what, in fact, care requires. So I hope you continue to get the care you need.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Joan. I think this has been a very important, very rich conversation so far, and we've taken up a lot of your time, and now we're coming close to the end of our time together, actually. But I'd like to make use of the fact that I have a microphone stuck to my head and ask you.
Go ahead.
One more final question, if you allow me. So you're going to the demonstration afterwards.
Yeah, the left demonstration.
Yeah, I mean, and it really speaks to your call to stand up as a democratic citizen. I really like that. So during your presentation, you talked about taking the power away from those who devalue care. That we have to change the system. And to me, that seems like care seems to push to and requires some form of activism. So the idea that care pushes towards active political engagement. I'm just curious what are your views on the relationship between care and activism? And for instance, how does this notion of civil disobedience, for instance, how does that figure into that relationship?
Well, this is a question, right? Care doesn't require activism. Democratic caring requires activism if you're living in an undemocratic situation, right? I mean, there are lots of ways to care that are not equal. There are lots of ways to care that take advantage of other people. Nobility living in big castles, having lots of servants, are being cared for really well. Not so much the servants, right? And so the question is, what kind of care do we want? And if we want care to be equal, if we want it to include, to come with the values of equality, justice, respect for others, everybody is possessed of dignity. If we want those to be our values, then we have to say we're living in a society where we are caring in ways that don't yield those results. Because care is a part of those other pieces. If we don't care equally, respectfully, then we're not going to be able to live in an equal, respectful society, no matter what else we do, or no matter what laws we pass, or no matter what views we espouse. So that's what makes activism necessary under those conditions. Civil disobedience, well, if you live in a bad state, this is the old Aristotelian question of whether you should be a good person or a good citizen. And my answer is Aristotle's, that the ideal thing is to live in a state which is a good state so you can be both. And if you don't, then you have some responsibility to try to make the state a good state so that you can be both a good person and a good citizen. Civil disobedience, my partner and I will have a discussion soon about, no, we really shouldn't get arrested today. And how are we going to avoid that? Because we have other responsibilities that have to be met. And we won't be able to meet them if we're both in a jail cell. So it's a hard question, and everybody's answer depends upon their particular circumstances. Care is pluralistic, and our responses to it and responses to the need for care have to be different depending upon our circumstances. So we have to do everything and just keep trying.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a wonderful note to end the conversation on. Give it your all at the demonstration. Don't get arrested. And thank you very much for your time and your wonderful insights. And I think we can give you another fantastic round of applause.
My pleasure to be in Ghent this morning, even if only virtually.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To the audience, thank you. Bedankt allemaal. Een dienstmededeling. Jullie kunnen tijdens de pauze, die is nu, een bezoek brengen naar de speeddaters, de filosofische speeddaters. En die mag je eigenlijk alles vragen. Alles. Ja. Geniet van de pauze en bedankt voor jullie input.
Bye.
Joan was er om half. We zijn begonnen 2:30 was zij er. Dan had ik een beetje gekregen van haar en mij. Maar ik dacht, oei, ik kan nog niet naar binnen. En dus op uw idee.
Nou, zeg ik niet. Ik dacht, ja, hier. Ik maar ik zit daar een vrouw en die zei, denk ik, dan wel gewoon met ja, dan zei ja, dat is dat ik hier. Dat is weer, ja, super, maar hier.
Ja, dat was
een goeie. Ja, en ook de gang met iets op.
Ja,
maar daar is ook